All right, we are live. Um, so my name is Greg. I'm being told that I'm not actually showing up on the video screen here, and that I'm just a blank screen. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Google Hangout is a great tool, but it always throws us some kind of curveball or another. So thanks for bearing with us as we talk through this. So this is basically just like a top-to-bottom introduction to the Open Referral Initiative and the problem that we're grappling with and the way that we're grappling with it. Really just meant as a briefing for newcomers. I'm going to have each of y'all introduce yourselves and share a little bit about your relationship to this problem of community resource directory data. And we can talk a little bit about how this might be relevant to you and your work. First, I'm thinking I'll sort of tell a little bit of the backstory of my own personal history on this problem, and then do those introductions with you all. And then we can talk a little bit about our strategic analysis. We can go a little deeper after we've all heard each other's personal backstory. How does that sound? Any questions? Any suggestions up top? Things you definitely know you want to talk about that you don't want me to forget?
Sounds great.
Okay, great. So, and just to share again, we will be taking notes over here. I've asked Barrett. Barrett doesn't have to, write down the stuff I've said because, we have that documented. But when y'all introduce yourselves, we'll sort of take some notes on who you are and what your questions are, that sort of thing. Cool. So, by way of introductions, my name is Greg. I started on this problem, working on this problem as sort of a side project through my job as communications guy at Bread for the City back in 2008. Bread for the City is a large, old, very well-respected nonprofit organization in the District of Columbia that provides medical care, legal counsel, food and clothing, and social services to residents of the District of Columbia. And among the many other things that they do within those departments, the social workers keep a directory of the other kinds of human services and social services that they refer people to when folks come to us for things that we didn't actually provide ourselves. That directory took the form of an access database that grew to have 1,500 different services listed in it. And over time, Bread actually, the intake, I say are because I'm still working with them, and also I really love the organization, so I'm part of the family. The intake, the number of people who would come to Bread really ballooned over the years to the point where they had 32,000 people coming through the doors, and 20,000 of them were just getting referrals elsewhere. The organization, because it kept careful track of what services were available, that was valuable information that was not available by Google or even by other organizations, and it increased the number of people who would come to Bread just to get referrals elsewhere. But it was important work that needed to be done somehow. So the social workers at Bread did it even though it increased their workload. And early on, we started having conversations about, A, how could we involve other social service providers in the maintenance of this information to lower the burden of the production of this information over time on Bread social workers. And B, how could we spread this information through other contexts? We knew that Bread had a certain way to use it in its intake procedures as people came through, like they used it in certain ways. We knew other people could use this data in other ways, and we early on started to talk about, this is really at the sort of start of the open data movement that has yielded a lot of different civic technology projects over the last 5-6 years. We started talking about how could we have some sort of shared platform, and as we started learning, we came to understand, okay, what we're really looking for isn't just one website that everybody would use. That's sort of the old model of like thinking about how to solve this problem, and it's never really worked very well because one website can't really meet everybody's needs. And we were thinking, how could we have a shared backend where everybody could have different websites, but it's calling from this the same database. And then even we went so far in 2012, 2013 to actually merge a bunch of different directories that were produced by different organizations and agencies in DC into one big file. And then it became clear, now that we had this big file, it was sort of like a Frankenstein's monster of different directory data sets. And none of the contributing organizations were going to be able to like actually make use of this big file because we lacked a common language that we could use to structure all of these different data sets together coherently. They were not interoperable. We merged them together, but it was just a big mess. And so at that point, we realized it wasn't about necessarily building one website that everybody would be able to use to get this information. It wasn't about even necessarily building one database. We knew enough at that point, by 2012, 2013, to understand that the different databases could actually talk to each other and exchange information if they had a common language. And that seemed like a hard political problem, like to develop a new data standard that's just like, that didn't really seem like a feasible project that we could take on ourselves in DC. And what changed, the sort of catalyzing event that gave us the opportunity to actually try to accomplish this, was that Google proposed, through a consortium of search engines called schema.org, Google proposed a schema, a structured data language for civic services that would enable websites to mark up their data with tags indicating this text is referring to an organization, this text is referring to a service that the organization provides, and this text is referring to a location, and all the other kinds of information like hours of operation, phone number. It was essentially a language for building a web page so that search engines could understand what's on that web page beyond just the raw text, could actually understand the objects that are listed on the page, the entities that are being described, and their relationships to each other, so that search results could actually return not just better links for search terms, but algorithmically there could be matching between queries that might not even have the text of what's in the service's description, but the search engine sort of knows that this is a kind of person who's looking potentially for this kind of service and can deliver results better, and even in a more structured way. Like when you search for movies on Google, you get you see the cast and the hours, the show times, and reviews, and you can even buy tickets. That's because the websites that have the show times and the casts and everything are marking their websites up with data that with the data language from schema.org. And that's sort of pointing the way towards a future in which people can actually find very rich information about services that are available to them that can meet their needs, simply because that information is being marked up by the organizations in their communities that have websites that direct them in one way or the other. That's not the only use case that we want to see in the world. We also want case managers to be able to use this data in their own way, and we want researchers to be able to understand the allocation of services against community needs and that sort of thing. But this was suddenly the opportunity to start a new conversation with organizations that have been in this field for a long time, that have certain ways of doing things, that inevitably any kind of institution is going to be resistant to change. This was our opportunity to say to institutions that have been doing this work for a long time, we can rally around a new language that's interoperable, both with the old ways of doing things and with the emerging new ways that are showing up on the internet of sharing this information. So that is the sort of the setting for what became the Open Referral Initiative and my role in it. I convened that conversation among Google, Code for America, and some other vendors who'd been in this space and and who'd been either for a brief period of time or even decades trying to solve this problem. And that conversation became the Open Referral Initiative that we have today. So with that, before I jump into what we're actually doing in the Open Referral Initiative, our analysis of the problem and how we're trying to solve it, I can pause there. That's my own personal backstory, and I'm curious to hear from you all, your own involvement, what kind of work you do with regards to local information, especially community resource directory information specifically. And also feel free to share any questions that you may have based on this story or what's moving ahead, and we can address them accordingly. Cool. So I can call on y'all one by one unless somebody wants to jump in first.
I'll go first.
Great.
My name is John Reidner. I'm the San Mateo County, California Open Data Community Liaison. San Mateo County is located between San Francisco and San Jose, out here in the Bay Area. And I have worked for the county for almost a year, working to open data from within the county and put it into our open data portal. but also to engage the community in using the county's data, which is kind of an interesting challenge. I apologize. I've been deathly ill, so
Oh,
that's why I sound like a frog to myself. So
you look all
uh,
right. You look good.
I'm feeling better. Um, and so a couple of years ago, there was a Code for America brigade that came and worked. I'm sorry, a fellowship that came and worked with folks in our human services agency to basically create an API, the Ohana API that did this, that aggregated all of the community service information into an API that would that created that one website that no one uses. And so, I'm interested in open referral because I have a background as a map and GIS librarian, so I'm always open to new data standards and excited about that kind of stuff. But also because the work that the Code for America Fellows did on the Ohana API is a couple of years old now, and we're having trouble with agencies and organizations updating their information, which is exactly the same problem with a paper-based binder method or something like that. So there's that problem that I'm interested in sort of figuring out how to get keep up-to-date information in in a system like that, and also how we also still print the sort of print brochure that people like to have, and I wonder if there's a way to leverage something like Open Referral to hopefully make the web or the online or push that information to people in a way that they don't want to use the print anymore.
Mm.
So,
Quick question: Are you pulling a report from the Ohana API in San Mateo County in order to then generate the text that you format into a printed directory? Is that how that's working?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I work at the central IT department, and
Uh-huh.
the Edwin Chan, who's
Yep.
the head of technology for HSA, is the one who's been working on that. I'm not sure if that's the case. I
Mhm.
know that it's not it's like a small pamphlet size um, print material, so I'm not sure that it's all the information or where it's sourced from, but I will find out. That's a good question.
Okay, so Francesca is you're going to be, I guess, chatting at us, and so maybe we can have, yeah, Francesca, go ahead and type some stuff, and while you're typing some stuff, I'm going to have Barrett introduce himself, and then I'll go back and read the stuff that you've typed. How about that? Great.
Sounds good. Um, yeah, so I'm a journalist, and I've covered a decent amount of tech stuff, and I've over the last year or so, Greg and I have been talking about the open referral program and what he's trying to accomplish. And of late, I've just kind of been brought into the loop to help troubleshoot and problem solve. And additionally, I've also organized hackathons. So I know how to get like the tech people together in a space and address problems and figure out the best ways to implement and come up with new ideas to handle all this stuff. It's slightly interesting to me how a journalism degree kind of equips you for all this stuff, but if you know how to talk to people and write stories and get people together and see patterns, you can apply that to a whole series of facets of life in like a productive way. And so that's kind of what's happening here.
Great.
I did that pretty quickly.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you. So let's see. Oh wow, Francesca just dropped a whole lot of knowledge in the chat box. So I'm going to read it aloud, and for you all. And no, thank you. Do not apologize. This is great. So here we go. Francesca works on a community resource guide called HIGHT, the Health Information Tool for Empowerment, at HIGHTsite.org. HIGHT is part of the Greater New York Hospital Association, which is a trade association for hospitals and nursing homes. HIGHT has been around since 2005 and has amassed about 5,000 listings. We collect and update information directly with listed organizations on a regular basis. Because most organizations listed in HIGHT are also existing and potential users. There is an outreach component to our data collection and verification process, in addition to standalone outreach efforts. As far as I know, Height is the most comprehensive source of community-based resources for New York City. No offense to other organizations doing this kind of work. Great, that's super interesting. Francesca, I'm certainly interested a little bit more about, you make some distinctions here between, an outreach component for data collection and verification in addition to standalone outreach efforts. Would love to hear a little bit more as you have time, as you're listening in terms of how that actually works, how that essentially labor is coordinated, and where you all want to go. What would your goals be? Generally speaking, our goals are to make this information easier to produce and easier to share in ways that are more sort of interoperable and holistic, so that we can see who's using what and things like that. Given those goals, what are some interests that you'd have for the future of Height? So go ahead, think about that, share anything that you can. And on that note, I'll talk a little bit about our strategic analysis of this problem, and I think John's contribution there really sets us up super helpfully on that. So I'll talk a little bit, but please think about your questions and chime in if anything does come up while I'm sort of holding forth. So to step back, the problem here, the core of this problem is that the organizations that provide services, whether they be public agencies, nonprofits, and so on, face a variety of capacity limitations and perverse incentives and disincentives that essentially interfere with their ability to be reliable, like up-to-date information, resources of information about their own services. That's our strategic analysis. And having been at an organization, been the person to whom this particular task fell, I totally understand why it's so hard to get organizations to actually participate in directory projects like these. You may very well be at an organization that provides 20, 30, 40 services at different facilities, and there's nobody who's responsible for updating that information in any particular place. And to actually accomplish that task takes a lot of time. And so we've seen a pattern of directory projects that try to throw up a website, have a login screen, people can go in and update their own information in theory, but in practice it just doesn't happen. Or even if it does happen, it's oftentimes like not even all that accurate information. And this is a common challenge. Ultimately, this information requires verification. It requires people to actually go through, look stuff up, call people, check to see whether what currently exists is still correct. And that's labor that's currently allocated in many silos. In any given community, you'll find multiple different directory projects that different organizations are pursuing in different ways. And our hypothesis is that ultimately this is the same information. It can be collected as the same data through a system of systems that share it. And so John mentioned the Ohana API. That was like Code for America had a fellowship team that was sort of on a parallel path to our project in DC, where they developed an API which, in layman's terms, is basically it's an application programming interface which enables a database to be accessed on the web by other systems, whether they're websites or mobile applications or whatever it may be. You can have a set of data that's in one place and it's automatically accessible by other applications who can just sort of speak to it and get what they need, rather than having to maintain their own database in their own system. So we've seen that technology transform a lot of different fields in a lot of different ways, and in this particular field, it's part of an answer to the question of how could we essentially enable a whole ecosystem of different kinds of services to share the same data. But as we've discovered, it's incomplete. It's not the whole answer. We can't simply put up an API and a login screen for organizations and expect correct information to be sustained over time. We need to answer the question of how to produce trustworthy data that's then openly available. And the way we're trying to answer this question is through a process of discovery in which we develop a common language and then help local groups, teams of different kinds of institutions use that language to discover their own means of answering the question of how will we work together to ensure that this information is up to date over time. So, for instance, there in San Mateo County, there's the Human Services Agency, which has traditionally contracted the production of this directory and now has this API. And they know that they can't produce this information alone. But we also know that 211 in Santa Clara, down the road, produces information not just on Santa Clara, the services in Santa Clara, but they also maintain information about services in San Mateo, because that's important to the people who are calling 211 in Santa Clara. They often need to know about information in San Mateo as well, right? It's a neighboring county. Their needs don't stop at the county border. And so the question is, could a network of organizations, including San Mateo HSA, Human Services Agency, and 211 of Santa Clara, and potentially other organizations in South Bay who currently produce their own resource directories or who would want to help produce a resource directory that they would have access to, can we help them find the means, the institutional model that will sort of distribute this burden, gradually decrease the cost for each individual group of maintaining this quality of this data over time, increase the quality of that data as more people are using it and more people are sharing feedback about what's correct and what's incorrect, and realize new potential uses of this data that go beyond the old form of printed directory, basic search website, etc., and actually start, like, by decreasing the cost of maintaining this data and making it openly available, accelerating the innovation by which people discover new ways to pull this data into new kinds of systems for new kinds of uses. And so to recap, Open Referral is both creating that common data language that enables these different systems to talk to each other and supporting local pilot projects as stakeholders use that language to discover and implement new, essentially, business models, sustainability models. And those models are probably going to look different in different places, because they're the same patterns in every place, but it shows up in different configurations of government and nonprofit and information intermediary and so on and so forth. So we basically embrace the fact that we just don't know what the right answer is to these questions, and we're going to find different possible answers in different possible places. And that's sort of the mode of inquiry with which we engage this work. So that's a little bit of our analysis, and the way I can get into more detail about how this, like the mechanics of this initiative, but wanted to pause there at the sort of capping of our strategic analysis of what is the problem and how should we try to solve it. If you have any questions, let me know, and I can also read off Francesca's elaboration over here in the chat field of how they do their work. But do you have any questions first, John Barrett?
Let's see. I don't want to get too in the weeds, but I really, what you were saying about one agency offering 30 or 40 different services, sort of, and how that impacts the interest and ability and capability for sort of keeping things up to date. I don't know. I guess I just wanted to comment and say I think that's a really interesting problem, because I wonder if so each case manager or worker at an organization looks for the information from other people's other entries, right? They don't. You don't ever look for your own. Yeah. So it doesn't matter if it's up to date, right? So. Yeah. From that perspective, so I don't know. It's just it's an interesting problem. Is there a way to balance sort of use and update? Incentivize updating by saying, well, we see you're using this. Right. Have you updated your information? That kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to find a lot of different answers to this question. We know our hypothesis is that as systems shift from being silos to quote-unquote open platforms, meaning you can access the data, this information, by using the website or whatever it may be, but other information systems can also access that information. As that happens, we expect more feedback from users of various kinds, indicating, this record isn't correct, or we actually know new information for this record, or this organization went away, or whatever it is. We're going to get more of that feedback, and our hypothesis is that as we get more of that feedback, it's going to be easier to maintain higher quality data. But we don't assume that simply by opening these platforms up, the cost of maintaining the information will drop to zero. You're still going to need someone some set of trusted stewards who are in a position of responsibility and authority to be able to say, we heard this and we checked it and it checks out, or it was a misunderstanding, or whatever it was. And in some cases, the answer to who should those stewards be may be clear, and in some cases, it's really not necessarily clear, and we may have to find entirely new answers. And our prerogative is to support local stakeholders as they figure out the right configuration for themselves. We are not coming in there and saying, here's the kind of agency that should do it, or we're going to do this for you, or anything like that, because ultimately a sustainable solution, we assume, is one in which the infrastructure of a community actually sort of evolves to address this problem itself, right? In some sort of way that they're fully bought into. And so, yeah, we can talk a little bit about how our pilot projects are working so far and what that might mean for each of your own individual communities. Francesca chimes in and says, our interests, and she's referring to Height, which, again, you can find at heightsite.org, I think. Yeah, heightsite.org, H-I-T-E. And they say their interests are creating stronger relationships with local CBOs and city agencies, and to, quote unquote, be there more for them as they try and get their staff comfortable in navigating resources. We have also come across initiatives and projects similar to ours, and so since those aren't really going anywhere, we don't know, there is a strong interest to work collaboratively to get our data in front of people who need it. And again, our assumption for Francesca and others, and in many cases this is a big paradigm shift, but our assumption is that the kind of interface that's going to connect somebody with services, if they're just using that interface themselves, is very different from the kind of interface that a nurse or a case manager might want to use. And currently we see a lot of attempts to meet the need of both regular end users and service providers in the same interface, and you end up not really meeting the needs of either. And our assumption is that by making this data available in a raw machine-readable form, it's easier for someone to develop the means for case managers, healthcare practitioners, and so on, to consume this information in their own environments, even someday like an electronic medical record system, so that this information would just show up alongside a patient's profile to suggest, hey, they might be eligible for, food stamps or whatever it may be, and here's where they go to access that program. And that enables people to focus more energy on developing specific tailored interfaces that work well, rather than the current model where everybody is trying to sort of meet a whole broad set of needs and not doing it necessarily all that effectively for anyone. And by the way, Francesca clarifies that what she meant, which I misrepresented, is that Height has been doing this a long time in New York City, and there are other resource directory projects that are similar and not going anywhere anytime soon, as in they're here to stay. And rather than cooperate, we should find ways for these different organizations that are probably delivering this information in different ways to cooperate at the level of the data. And that does entail, in many cases, a shift from thinking about this data as our data that we own to thinking about this data as public information that we are stewarding. And that's a big psychological shift for many people and organizations, and our job is to show that actually there's benefit at the end of that shift, right? That an organization that's aggregating this information and making use of it in one way can let others make use of it in other ways in a way that is still about that source organization's bottom line. That you can give away open data, quote unquote, give it away in means that can yield value, whether that value is sort of more sort of soft long-term support from institutions in the area that now know that they can fund one organization to be the source and aggregator of this information, and other organizations that they fund are going to be able to benefit from that data in other ways, and then it becomes more important for them to fund the sustaining source, or even more specific ways of, like, you make an API available to access a resource directory database in a way that's free for some basic level of access, but for some vendor that's providing a service that adds value to that data to some other institution that's willing to pay for it, you might actually say, hey, our API will give up to 100 hits a day for free, and beyond that, you have to become a premium user, right? Or maybe you can do basic searches of the API for free, but if you want to combine the kind of personal information in those searches that gives you really targeted results, which is what you're going to need to build a business around our data, we're going to have to charge for that added value service of that complex access to our API. So we definitely define open in a broad and interpretable sense. We want to see business models that sustain the production of open data, and we understand that that is really the challenge. The challenge isn't just getting data and opening up. It's figuring out how are these systems going to be sustained over time. And again, Francesca says they are talking, Hindsight is talking to, they're taking steps towards electronic medical records integration. They're already in talks with some organizations around this. And we believe that these data intermediaries should be exploring different ways to give other kinds of information systems access to their data. The important step is that that information is structured in a predictable way. That makes it easier for developers to develop an app in one particular context and redeploy it in other particular contexts. It makes it easier for organizations that collect data on different domains to make their data talk to each other coherently. The really important thing is, as organizations explore new ways to get their data into new systems, that they're using the same language so that we preserve interoperability. So we have this sort of like two-tiered approach of developing that language and supporting these pilot projects as they figure out what's going to work. And I can talk a little bit about how our pilot projects are specifically working, and that will probably bring us to about 11:45. So we'll have a few minutes left for final questions, but I'll pause here. Does anybody have questions, thoughts, comments, something you particularly want to see in the time we have left here?
I just want to make a quick comment. One of the one of the means of using open data that I've been talking a lot about with folks here in California. I was just at the State Health and Human Services open data meeting a couple weeks ago. Is instead of building these applications or sites that here's where all the information is. Actually pushing that information, that data out to people where they are, where they already are. So the kind of, the structured markup and stuff like that from schema.org, I think is fantastic, because this is not only information that people maybe don't ever think about until they need it, or even after they need it, but it's also specialized knowledge. So knowing the difference between a board and care and a group home, and all these other things that people they may not know what they're looking for. Right. And so structuring the data to be able to push it out in a variety of ways, that's fantastic. That's right.
I think that that's a great comment. I mean, for some more context, the system that Code for America built, that the fellows built in San Mateo, they built an API is basically a data system, and then they built a front end called SMC Connect, San Mateo County Connect, that's a very clean and attractive looking web page, right? It looks real nice. And it has a very simple search field that says I need ... And the challenge is that in many cases people don't necessarily know how to describe what they need, or they don't know how to describe the sort of addressable needs, right? That the things for which there are services that can help meet their needs. They may be having struggles with housing that are essentially legal problems, even though it feels like they just can't pay their rent. And so the ability to have a website that has a service search, simple field is nice, but we also want legal service providers, healthcare providers, even Google and other kinds of mobile apps that are able to connect people with information that they might not have known to search for themselves. Let's see. Francesca says, yeah, that's right. That's right. People, yeah. And our hunch is that by enabling a collective solution to this collective problem of this data, it's going to make it easier for people to quickly and with less burden experiment with different means of delivering this information. We just had a new person join the call. Derek, I see you there. Are you able to hear us and see us? Derek says yes, but we haven't heard from him yet. Unfortunately, you just came in where we were basically wrapping up our introduction to this whole initiative, and but it will be available to watch via video immediately after this. In the meantime, if you have questions for us, or if you want to give an introduction and you're having trouble with your audio, it looks like you're muted at the moment, but there may be trouble on your end, go ahead and chat it into the comment bar, and I'll read it aloud. So let me speak a little bit for 5 minutes or so about how our pilot projects are working, and then we can think about how it might, how it might apply to your particular communities. So again, we've developed this format through interviews with stakeholders in these initial pilots, where you had some institutions that stepped forth and said they wanted to do something. The format is the sort of tool that each institution in these pilot projects is agreeing to publish and consume from, publish to and consume from. And the idea is that in exchange for them essentially being early adopters of this untested and still buggy format, their feedback and their prerogatives are going to be the most important. They're going to carry the weight that shapes this thing. So those pilot projects, those group of stakeholders, consist of some combination of a government champion, some government agency that says we want to see a solution to this problem in our community, such as San Mateo HSA, or also the mayor's office of San Francisco. They've been the government champion in San Francisco. In Alameda County, it's Alameda County Healthcare Services Agency. In DC, it's the DC Department of Human Services. Some combination of government champion with referral provider, such as 211 or such as potentially HeightSite, and also a community anchor institution, such as a health clinic or a library, some kind of organization that faces an in-person day-to-day need to use this information and wants to essentially experiment with new ways of getting this data sort of in their system automagically. So that's sort of the core minimal components. We could have more, a pilot project could have more people from more organizations than that, but if we have some combination of government champion, referral provider, and community anchor, and they're able to appeal to funders in their area to essentially help them build the capacity to engage in change management and to engage in sort of experimentation and discovery. If we have those elements, then we have ourselves a pilot project. And Derek just asked us, what is all this about? Derek, check out openreferral.org. So the pilot that I was just describing, we have a pilot project in Washington, D.C., as I mentioned. with my old organization, Bread for the City, and the district government, that they have there's 2 different data systems that were previously siloed. They're moving each of those data systems into an open platform, and then we're going to experiment with different ways of getting that platform to talk to those 2 platforms to talk to each other. And we don't exactly know what that's going to look like yet. We're eager to get to that prototyping phase. In San Francisco, you have a bunch of different city agencies that are all producing directories, and they're figuring out through their open data platform in Socrata, how do we go from producing all these different PDFs and Excel sheets to having some sort of shared governmental repository of resource directory information. And also there's the 211 for San Francisco, which is operated by the United Way of the Bay Area, which receives government and also private philanthropic funding, producing the same information in their own system. They're getting their system, which is on a software platform called iCarol, to essentially speak via API the same open referral language that the government is going to be formatting its different directories into. And we also have community-based organizations that aggregate information, and they're figuring out among themselves how to go from 3 different silos that sort of manually trade data back and forth in a really cumbersome process to some sort of shared data repository that can feed all of their systems. And then in South Bay, I think actually there's a few different ways that a pilot in South Bay could come together, and I'm eager to talk with you, probably offline, John, about what that might look like. And Francesca, we also have a potential. I think there is a strong potential for a pilot in New York City, and I'm actually traveling there next week to meet with some folks like Single Stop and Civic Hall and a few others. So Derek is a troll. He's telling us that he'd like to troll Geek Squad on the air. No, that's not really right. I'm gonna eject Derek. Thanks, y'all. Okay. Cool. So any questions about how the pilot projects are working, or how what goes into getting one started? Any questions about how we've developed our data spec so far, or next steps, anything like that?
I have a quick question, just to use DC for example. You said there was the government champion, the referral provider, and the community champion. And so Bread for the City would be the referral provider, and DC government would be the government champion, right?
Yeah. So these categories that I laid out of government champion, referral provider, and community anchor, they're not always crystal clear. In this case, Bread for the City has a referral system, so they're sort of a community anchor that is also a referral provider, I would say, right? They have an information system that they're using to connect people with directory and with essentially referrals. Also, the district government operates the 211, so it's also that's unusual. In DC and New York City, actually, are 2 of the only instances where a 211 system is actually owned and operated by the government. And so in DC, we have a number of community anchor institutions that are ready to participate, one community anchor institution that already has a referral system that it wants to open up, and then a government champion that also operates a referral system that it's seeking to improve. So that's an instance where those categories that I laid out are sort of a little collapsed in on each other. We're not trying to be really rigid about what are the ingredients of a pilot project, what must you have. Those are just the important elements that in DC's case it pretty much does have. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it did, because I could see how each organization could do a bit more if I was getting notification. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yep. Francesca says, her questions are NYC specific. I think, Francesca, high-level sort of gaming out of what this might look like is a good use of our time here. So if you do have a question about New York City that you think, I think it's great to have examples of how this could work in different contexts, and I have learned a little bit about New York City. You probably know more, but go ahead and hit me with a question about New York, and let's see what we come up with. And in the meantime, I'll also give a heads up. In the next conversation that starts at noon EST and 9 PST, we'll have folks who've actually been working with the format, who've been trying to build directory systems that talk to each other. It might only be 2 or 3 folks, but they'll get on and we'll get a little technical. We'll go into some deep issues as well as like process and stuff like that. So Francesca asks, basically at a high level, who's involved in New York City, and I can share a memo where I've sort of laid out, here are the key players. To speak quickly about New York City, because I think it's a really interesting scenario. Like, obviously, biggest city in the country, one of the only cities in the country without a quote-unquote legacy 211 system of its own, or a high-level INR operation center. They have a 211 system that's a part of the city's 311 system. It's government operated, and as I understand it, they mostly have in the 211 system information about city agencies, with a couple of subdomains that they have, like community-based organizations that they know about. Mostly the government is only keeping track of the government's own services in the 211 system. So if you call with a problem of any kind, they're going to just route you to the nearest most relevant government agency. And based on my conversations with people inside and outside of government, there's not really a strong sense that this is really serving the needs of people who are calling 211 very well. That ultimately it makes sense to have only one number. Like 311 is the one number that you call for anything that's not an emergency in New York. That does make sense, but the government never was able to muster the capacity, which is totally understandable because it's a big task, to monitor all the services that are available in the city that it doesn't provide. Now, the government could play a role potentially in requiring that all of the services that it funds, which in New York is actually a large percentage of all the different services, it could require that all the services that it funds report the information, their information, through the Open 311 system, or possibly, to get technical, the NYC Accelerator system, the HHS Accelerator system, which is like the contracting mechanism for all health, human, and social services. That's probably going to be a policy level change that very well may be good for everyone, may be good for the government and for the community, but we don't expect it's going to happen like right off the bat just because somebody says that'd be a good idea. That's going to take a long time. So while we have our eyes on that possibility, we want to find other ways, A, to potentially make use of the city published, the directory data on the city services that's already available in their Open 311 platform, and B, find the different aggregators in New York who are collecting data on all kinds of services, and find value propositions for them to essentially share on some level in some way. And so the other aggregators include Single Stop, which is like their primary function is to enroll people in benefits programs, and so they don't, the service directory information is something that they need to provide a good service, but it's not necessarily something they view themselves as specializing in, and they would love to have some sort of collaborative solution. There are also vendors called Healthify, and I think a few others. I think Aunt Bertha also now has resource directory data for New York City. And so the question is, given all this duplication of effort, is there some kind of way that we can actually have a sort of shared common data pool that serves these different ones, while also engaging in conversations with the city about how it could actually start publishing data on the services that it funds over the long run to lessen the burden. Francesca says, she mentioned Single Stop and Aunt Bertha. She also asks which city agency is involved. I've been talking with HHS Accelerator and the HHS Connect programs. New York City's actually done great work in consolidating all the different contracting systems into one common system for all health, human, and social services. They've also consolidated all these different benefits, like food stamps and Medicaid, into one portal so that people just fill in their information once and they can access all these different benefits. And this does seem like a logical next step, potentially. So I would be happy to follow up more with you, Francesca and John, about some of the specifics about your community afterwards. And Barrett, we're going to be talking about DC at length. And also another thing is I'm hoping to improve the content of these orientations over time. So I'd really love any feedback that you might have about, suggestions for how to present this pretty complex information, or other kinds of questions we can suggest, or ways that we can engage participants to make this time even more productive when we do it in the future. But we have only about 7 minutes left before the assembly, so I'll pause there. Any final thoughts or questions?
Nope, I'm good.
Great. Cool. Cool. So I will end this broadcast. I'll be following up with all y'all individually. You're welcome to join the assembly if you want to get into some of the nitty-gritty with us, and that starts in about 5-6 minutes. Thanks, y'all.
Great, thanks.
I never did show up on the video screen, did I?
No, unless you're a very dark individual.
Okay. All right.
In a dark room.
Bummer. Okay. All right. Well, thanks anyways. Sorry about the technical difficulties. I appreciate the chance to talk.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you.